The call button was a lie. It was a small, plastic promise of immediate relief. But in the cacophony of the third-floor surgical recovery ward at Northbridge General, it was just one more voice screaming into the void. Alara Vance knew this. She moved not to the rhythm of the chimes and beeps, but to the silent, predictive hum of crisis she had learned to feel in the air. Right now, that hum was emanating from room 308. Her worn sneakers, a rebellion against the squeaky orthopedic clogs favored by her colleagues, made no sound on the polished linoleum. She glided past a frantic junior nurse struggling with a tangled IV line and an orderly pushing a rattling gurney, her focus a pinpoint laser aimed at 308. The room's monitor was broadcasting a frantic, high-pitched alarm that signaled a drop in blood oxygen saturation, a DSAT, in the clipped, urgent language of the floor. Inside, Mr. Henderson, a retired postal worker 2 days out from a colectomy, was turning a dusky shade of blue. His eyes were wide with a terror that went beyond words. He was choking. "He's aspirating," Alara said, her voice cutting through the panic of the family member at his bedside. Her hands were already moving, a blur of practiced efficiency. One hand hit the code blue button on the wall, flooding the hospital with a more urgent alarm, while the other snatched a portable suction catheter from the supply cart. "It's okay, George. I've got you. Look at me," she commanded, her tone a perfect blend of authority and calm. She rolled him onto his side with a strength that belied her slender frame, inserted the catheter, and cleared his airway in a single, decisive motion. Color began to seep back into the old man's face as his chest rose with a ragged, life-affirming gasp. Just as the code team thundered into the room, a whirlwind of white coats and crashing carts, Alara was already stepping back, fading into the background. She had done her job. The cavalry was here to do theirs. As she slipped out, she nearly collided with a man who seemed to suck the very air out of the hallway. Mr. Davies, the hospital administrator, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes not on the life-or-death drama unfolding in room 308, but on a small, dark scuff mark on the wall beside the door. "Nurse," he said, his voice as thin and cold as a razor's edge. He didn't use her name. He rarely used anyone's. "See that this is dealt with. This is the VIP wing. Appearances matter." "Yes, Mr. Davies," Alara murmured, her adrenaline-fueled pulse thrumming with a familiar spike of resentment. He hadn't seen a woman save a man's life. He had seen a smudge on his pristine, profitable wall. He was a man who managed spreadsheets, not people, who saw patients not as human beings in need of care, but as billable units with the potential for liability. His presence was a constant, chilling reminder that at Northbridge General, the bottom line was always more important than the lifeline. Walking away, she felt another presence, a different kind of authority, intercept her path. Dr. Regina Croft, the head of nursing, stood with her arms crossed, her lips pursed into a thin line of perpetual disapproval. She had a face that looked like it had been carved from hardened soap. "Vance!" she snapped, her eyes flicking toward the now stable situation in 308. "Did you check the drip rate on Mrs. Gable's saline lock in 312? I adjusted it myself this morning. It's calibrated for a reason. Your intuitive approach to medicine is not a substitute for established protocol." "I was with Mr. Henderson, Dr. Croft. He was in respiratory distress," Alara explained, keeping her voice level. "The code team handles the distress. You handle your assigned duties," Croft retorted, her gaze sweeping over Alara's non-regulation sneakers with disdain. "And get proper footwear. This is a medical facility, not a gymnasium." Dr. Croft was the embodiment of the system Davies championed. She was a zealot of the procedural manual, a woman who found comfort in rules and saw any deviation as a personal affront. To her, Alara's quick thinking wasn't an asset. It was a chaotic variable, a dangerous spark of insubordination in her well-oiled machine. The fact that Alara was universally liked by the patients and respected by the junior staff only seemed to fuel her professional jealousy. Alara nodded, murmured another, "Yes, doctor," and continued her rounds. The frustration a bitter pill she had to swallow a dozen times a shift. This was her world. A battlefield where she fought not only against disease and decay, but also against the cold, unfeeling bureaucracy that was supposed to be on her side. She was drowning in student loan debt, working back-to-back doubles just to stay afloat, all for the privilege of being treated like a disobedient child by administrators who wouldn't know a suction catheter from a coffee stirrer. Her final check-in of the morning was in the furthest room of the VIP wing, a suite that was larger than her entire apartment. Room 320. The patient was Dr. Alistair Finch. The name on the chart was unassuming, But Ilara, who had a curious mind, had looked him up. Dr. Alistair Finch, Nobel laureate in chemistry, a man whose work on protein folding had revolutionized drug development and saved, in a quiet, abstract way, millions of lives. Now, he was an 82-year-old man in a hospital gown, recovering from a minor cardiac catheterization. When she entered, he wasn't watching the massive flat-screen TV, but was staring intently at the intricate dance of fluids and bubbles within his own IV drip. "Fascinating, isn't it?" he said, his voice a dry, reedy whisper that still held the precise cadence of a lifelong academic. "The delicate interplay of gravity, viscosity, and hydrostatic pressure. A perfect, self-contained system." Ilara smiled. "I suppose it is, Doctor. I'm just here to make sure that system doesn't spring a leak." She checked his vitals, her movements efficient and gentle. He watched her, his pale blue eyes missing nothing. Unlike most patients, who were lost in a fog of pain or boredom, Dr. Finch was an observer. "You're the one who saved George Henderson this morning," he stated. "It wasn't a question. I heard the commotion. I also heard that administrator complaining about the scuff mark afterward. He has what I would call a catastrophic lack of perspective." Ilara was taken aback. I just did what anyone would have done." "No, my dear," Dr. Finch corrected gently. "You did what was necessary. It's a tragically rare quality. Most people do what they are told. Tell me, what is the half-life of the saline solution in this bag, assuming a constant drip rate of 75 milliliters per hour?" The question was so unexpected, so out of place, that Ilara blinked. It wasn't a medical question. It was a math problem, a puzzle. She quickly did the calculation in her head. The bag is 1 liter, so about 6.5 hours to get to 500 milliliters. The half-life would be just under 7 hours. Dr. Finch's thin lips curved into a genuine beatific smile. It transformed his entire face. "Precisely. You see beyond the task and understand the system. A rare quality indeed." He looked at her, truly looked at her, with an appreciation that felt more validating than any paycheck or formal commendation she had ever received. "Thank you for your excellent care, nurse." Ilara Vance. Ilara," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "A pleasure." As she left his room, Ilara felt a small, warm spark ignite in her chest. It was the feeling of being seen, of being understood. In a world of petty tyrants like Davies and Croft, a single moment of recognition from a man like Alistair Finch felt like a shield. It was a fragile armor, but for now, it was enough. She walked back into the hallway, feeling a renewed sense of purpose, completely unaware that in less than an hour, her entire world was about to shatter, and that small, warm spark of validation would be the only thing left to guide her through the encroaching darkness. The calm, when it came, was almost unsettling. The midday lull had descended upon the 3rd floor. The code team had long since departed, Mr. Henderson was stable and sleeping, and even the relentless call buttons had fallen into a temporary, blessed silence. Ilara stood at the central nursing station, updating charts and finally allowing herself the simple luxury of a deep breath. She could feel the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. For a few precious minutes, the hum of crisis had faded. She thought of Dr. Finch's question, the unexpected intellectual challenge, and allowed herself a small smile. It was in that fleeting moment of peace that the world tore itself apart. It started with a sound from down the hall, near the lab dispensary, a sharp, metallic clatter, followed by the unmistakable, sickening crunch of shattering glass. It was a sound of pure accident, of something heavy, meeting something fragile. Then came the gasp, a collective intake of breath from the few people in the hallway, followed a split second later by a new alarm. This one wasn't the rhythmic chime of a call button or the urgent pulse of a code blue. This was a shrill, continuous, ear-splitting shriek, a hazardous materials alarm, a code orange. Ilara's head snapped up. Her brief respite was annihilated, replaced by a surge of ice-cold adrenaline. Down the corridor, a sickly green-yellow vapor was boiling up from the floor, pouring from the wreckage of a toppled lab transport cart. It billowed outward with unnatural speed, thick and opaque, clinging to the linoleum like a living thing. The acrid, metallic stench of corrosive chemicals hit her seconds later, burning her nostrils and making her eyes water. Panic erupted. A visiting family member screamed. An orderly, a young kid barely out of his teens, froze in place, his face a mask of disbelief. "Code orange! Seal the wing! Evacuate now!" Dr. Croft's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. She was already at the main intersection, directing staff away from the spill and toward the emergency stairwell, her face pale but her movements decisive. For all her petty tyranny, in a crisis defined by protocol, she was in her element. "Follow procedure. Doors sealed. Now!" Staff and ambulatory patients scrambled, their movements clumsy with fear. Heavy, magnetically locked fire doors began to slide shut with a heavy thump, isolating the contaminated zone. Ilara's training kicked in. Her job was clear: evacuate her section, seal the rooms, get to safety. She began moving toward her patients' rooms, her mind a checklist of emergency procedure. Then she saw him. Through a gap between a closing fire door and the wall, she saw the frail figure of Dr. Alistair Finch. He had stepped out of his room, perhaps curious about the initial commotion, and was now caught in the hallway. The main evacuation route was cut off by the spill, and the advancing vapor was less than 20 feet from him. He was disoriented by the shrieking alarm, his movements slow and unsteady. He was shuffling away from the gas, but he was a man in his 80s, frail and weak. He wasn't going to make it. He was trapped. Ilara's mind became a war zone. Two voices screamed at her with equal, deafening intensity. Protocol. The voice of Dr. Croft, of Mr. Davies, of her entire training. Seal the doors. The hazmat team handles the contamination zone. Do not enter. Contain the spill. Protect the many. Instinct. The voice of the woman who had suctioned Mr. Henderson's airway. The voice that knew a life was measured in seconds, not in procedure codes. He'll die. He's going to die right there, 20 feet away from you. "Vance! Seal that door!" Dr. Croft shrieked from the safe side of the corridor, her voice muffled by the thick glass of the fire door window. Ilara saw Dr. Finch stumble. He coughed, a wet, ragged sound that was barely audible over the alarm. He was breathing it in. His brilliant mind, the mind that had unraveled the secrets of life itself, was about to be extinguished by a clumsy accident on a Tuesday afternoon. The war in her head lasted a nanosecond and an eternity. She saw the sterile text of the hospital safety manual, and she saw the kind, intelligent eyes of the man who had seen her, who had understood her. Protocol lost. In a single, fluid motion, she spun around, ignoring Dr. Croft's frantic banging on the fire door. Her eyes scanned the wall, searching. She found it. A heavy, fluid-resistant fire blanket in a red metal case. She smashed the glass with her elbow, the pain a distant flare, and ripped the blanket free. "Hold your breath!" she screamed at Dr. Finch, though she knew he couldn't hear her. Taking one last deep gulp of clean air, she plunged into the corridor. The world dissolved into a blur of green-yellow haze. The chemical stench was overpowering now, a physical presence that clawed at her throat and sinuses. It felt like inhaling shards of glass. Her eyes burned, tears streaming down her face. She reached Dr. Finch in 3 long strides. He looked at her, his face a mixture of terror and confusion. There was no time for words. She threw the heavy, unwieldy blanket over his head and body, creating a makeshift shield against the worst of the vapor. "This way!" she yelled, her voice a raw croak. She grabbed his thin arm and shoved him, with all her strength, toward a small, unmarked service door a few feet away, a door leading to a clean utility closet she knew was there from her rounds. He was dead weight, his body limp with shock and the effects of the gas. Her lungs were screaming for air, black spots dancing at the edges of her vision. The skin on her forearms, exposed below her short sleeves, began to prickle and burn as if touched by 1,000 hot needles. She bundled him through the door, tumbling into the small, dark space after him, and slammed it shut just as the thickest part of the chemical cloud rolled over the spot where they had been standing. The silence inside the closet was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing and the muffled, distant shriek of the alarm. Ilara ripped the blanket off Dr. Finch. He was gasping, his face pale and clammy, but he was breathing. He was alive. Ilara leaned against the wall, her own body trembling uncontrollably. She took a shuddering breath, and the air that filled her lungs was clean, untainted. But the damage was done. The chemical had found its way in. A fire burned in her chest, and the skin on her arms was already turning an angry, inflamed red. Through the small, wire-reinforced window in the door, she could see the corridor, now completely submerged in the toxic, swirling green-yellow fog. On the other side of the fire door, she could just make out the furious, disbelieving face of Dr. Regina Croft, staring at the empty space where her subordinate had just committed the most egregious act of insubordination she had ever witnessed. Ilara had followed her instinct. She had saved a life, and in doing so, she had just destroyed her own. The world returned in fragments, muffled voices, warped and distant, speaking through the thick helmets of the hazmat team. The hiss of decontamination showers, the cold, stinging spray against her burning skin. The sterile, impersonal feel of a hospital gown that wasn't her own. When the chaos finally subsided, Alara found herself in an isolation room in the emergency department. The fire in her lungs dulled to a persistent ache and her arms slathered in a soothing anesthetic cream. She was a patient in the very hospital where, hours earlier, she had been a caregiver. The irony was as sharp and bitter as the chemical taste that still lingered at the back of her throat. Her first official visitor was not a friend or a concerned colleague, but Dr. Madsen, the on-call physician for internal incidents. He was a creature of the hospital's legal department, a doctor whose primary function was to document, not to heal. He entered with a tablet computer, his expression a carefully neutral mask. "Nurse Vance," he began, not making eye contact as he tapped at the screen. "I need to complete an incident report. Let's start with your exposure. You were aware of the code orange alarm?" "Yes, of course," Alara said, her voice raspy. "And you received a direct order from your superior, Dr. Croft, to seal the area and evacuate?" Dr. Finch was trapped. He would have been overcome by the fumes. Madsen's fingers continued to tap. He didn't look up. "The report is not concerned with hypotheticals, only with actions. So, you can confirm you made the conscious decision to enter a designated contamination zone without personal protective equipment?" Every question was a carefully laid brick in the wall they were building around her. His tone was dispassionate, his language meticulously chosen. He wasn't inquiring about her well-being. He was taking her deposition. He asked if she had physically moved the patient against his will, if she was aware of the specific protocols outlined in the Hazardous Materials Manual, if she understood the chain of command in an emergency situation. The heroism, the split-second decision, the life saved, none of it mattered. It was all stripped away, leaving only a clinical, damning record of her transgressions. She wasn't a hero being treated. She was a liability being assessed. An hour later, cleared from medical observation, but not from institutional purgatory, she was summoned. Not to her floor, not to the nurse's station, but to the top floor of the administrative tower. To the office of Mr. Davies. The office was a testament to his personality. Cold, minimalist, and expensive. A single, abstract painting hung on a vast white wall, its chaotic splashes of color a stark contrast to the rigid order of the room. Mr. Davies sat behind a glass desk that was utterly devoid of personal effects. Beside him, silent and motionless, sat a woman in a severe gray suit whose expression suggested she was personally offended by the concept of oxygen. This was Eleanor Vance, the hospital's chief legal counsel. "Sit," Davies commanded, gesturing to a hard, uncomfortable chair positioned precisely in the center of the room. Alara sat, her hands clasped in her lap. She felt small, a specimen under a microscope. "Nurse Vance," Davies began, his voice dangerously soft, "I have spent the last 3 hours in meetings with the board, our insurance carrier, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Do you have any idea the magnitude of the situation you have created?" "I saved Dr. Finch's life," Alara said, the words feeling weak and insufficient in the sterile air of the room. The lawyer, Miss Vance, spoke for the first time, her voice like cracking ice. "You committed a reckless act of gross negligence. You violated at least 5 key safety protocols, starting with the willful disobedience of a direct order from a superior. You exposed yourself, a patient, and potentially the entire ventilation system on this side of the hospital to an uncontained corrosive agent," Davies continued, leaning forward. His eyes were like chips of granite. "You created a multi-million-dollar liability, a PR nightmare that we are now struggling to contain, and you have triggered a full-scale federal investigation. Saving a life, as you put it, is irrelevant to the procedural breach." The word irrelevant hung in the air, a stunning, brutal negation of everything she believed in. "Effective immediately, you are placed on unpaid administrative leave pending the outcome of our internal investigation," Davies declared. "You are not to set foot on hospital grounds. You are not to contact any member of the hospital staff. And you are especially not to contact Dr. Finch. Is that understood?" The threat was clear. They were isolating her, cutting her off from anyone who could corroborate her side of the story, especially the one man whose testimony could exonerate her. She was no longer just a liability, she was an enemy of the institution. The next day, the punishment escalated. reaching beyond the hospital walls and into the official mechanisms of the state. Two police officers appeared at her apartment door. They were polite, professional, but their presence was an intimidation. They were there to take her formal statement for the official incident report. Sitting at her small kitchen table, Alara recounted the events, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The older officer, a man with a weary, seen-it-all face, took notes in a small book. "So, let me just get this timeline straight," he said, his pen poised. "You heard the alarm, you heard the order to evacuate, and then you decided to go back into the danger zone. Is that correct?" "Yes, but only to get Dr. Finch." "And you physically moved Dr. Finch from the hallway into a closet?" "To get him to safety, yes." "Did he ask you to move him?" "He couldn't speak, he was choking." The officer just nodded, writing. Subject Vance states the patient was unable to give consent. He wasn't malicious. He was just a cog in a different machine, one that translated human experience into the cold, hard language of reports and potential litigation. He was stripping her act of its context, its humanity, reducing it to a series of facts that, on paper, made her look like a rogue agent who had potentially assaulted a patient during a hazardous chemical spill. The culmination of her trial came 2 days after the incident. She was summoned back to the hospital for a disciplinary hearing. The room was a small, soulless conference room. Davy sat at the head of the table, flanked by the lawyer and a stone-faced woman from Human Resources. Dr. Regina Croft sat opposite Alara, her expression a mask of grim satisfaction. It was a kangaroo court, a show trial. Dr. Croft was called to give her account first. She spoke in a calm, authoritative voice, painting a picture of Alara as a chronically insubordinate employee with a dangerous hero complex. "Nurse Vance has always had a problem with authority," Croft stated, looking directly at the panel. "She often deviates from established care plans, relying on what she calls intuition rather than evidence-based procedure. On the day of the incident, my order to seal the corridor was clear, precise, and in accordance with all safety protocols. Her decision to ignore that order was not just insubordination, it was a reckless act that jeopardized the containment effort and put everyone at greater risk." Alara tried to interject, to explain, but Davies cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "You will have your turn." When her turn came, her words felt like stones dropping into a bottomless well. They questioned her motives, her emotional state, her judgment. They presented security footage, grainy and silent, that showed her running toward the spill, a clear violation of every rule. Without the context of Dr. Finch's presence, she looked unhinged. Finally, Davies delivered the ultimatum. "The board has reviewed the preliminary findings," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Given the severity of the breaches, we have grounds for immediate termination for cause. This would, of course, necessitate a full report to the State Nursing Board, which would almost certainly result in the permanent revocation of your license." He let the words hang in the air, a professional death sentence. "However," he continued, sliding a thick document across the table, "the hospital is prepared to be lenient. This is a non-disclosure and settlement agreement. In it, you formally admit to a lapse in judgment due to situational stress. You voluntarily resign your position, effective immediately. In return, the hospital will not contest your unemployment benefits. We will not file a report with the nursing board, and we will consider the matter closed. You will, of course, be bound by the confidentiality clause, meaning you will never speak of this incident or your employment at Northbridge to anyone, ever." Alara stared at the document. It was a confession. A lie. It was a gag order in exchange for the tattered remnants of her career. "I saved his life," she whispered, more to herself than to them. The lawyer, Miss Vance, gave a pitying, reptilian smile. "Dr. Finch is a world-renowned scientist. He is also a very old man who was disoriented during a traumatic event. His recollection would be deemed unreliable. We have eyewitness testimony from a department head and clear video evidence of your actions. Sign the agreement, Nurse Vance. It's the only way you'll ever practice medicine again." She was trapped. They had taken her heroism and twisted it into a crime. They had used their power, their procedures, and their lawyers to crush her. She left the room with the document in her trembling hands, the weight of it feeling heavier than any burden she had ever carried. She had 48 hours to sign away her integrity to save her future. She walked out of the hospital, no longer a nurse, no longer a hero, but just a liability they were trying to erase. The world shrank to the four walls of Alara's small third-floor apartment. The city hummed on outside her window, oblivious. The NDA sat on her cheap IKEA coffee table, a white flag of surrender. For 24 hours, it was the only thing she could see. Every time she looked at it, a wave of nausea and helpless rage washed over her. The document was a masterpiece of legal cruelty. It demanded she accept responsibility for creating a hazardous work environment and acknowledge her failure to adhere to critical safety protocols. Signing it felt like a betrayal of the single, crystalline moment of certainty she'd had in that hallway. It was an admission that her instinct to save a life was a mistake. How could she sign that? But if she didn't, her life was over. The debt that already suffocated her would become an anchor, dragging her down into a future with no prospects. Davies and Croft would win. The system would win. She was utterly, profoundly alone. Then, a small crack appeared in the wall of her isolation. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Maria, a junior nurse she had mentored. "Heard what they're doing to you. It's disgusting. You did the right thing. Don't let them tell you otherwise. We're all thinking of you." Alara stared at the message, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't a solution, it wasn't a legal strategy, but it was something. It was a whisper of truth in the hurricane of lies. She wasn't crazy. Someone else saw what she saw. Later that evening, an email arrived from an unknown address. The sender identified himself as Ben Carter, a blogger who ran a local investigative news site called the City Standard. "Miss Vance, I received an anonymous tip from an employee at Northbridge General regarding the incident 2 days ago. The official story the hospital is spinning to its staff is that you acted recklessly, but my source says you saved Dr. Alistair Finch's life and are being punished for it. I believe there is a major story here about hospital administration prioritizing liability over patient care. Would you be willing to speak with me, off the record?" Her heart hammered against her ribs. The story was leaking. But fear, cold and sharp, immediately followed. Speaking to a journalist would be a declaration of war. They would not just fire her, they would obliterate her. With trembling fingers, she typed a reply. "I'm sorry, I have no comment." But the seed was planted. The truth was out there, however fragile. Meanwhile, in the quiet, climate-controlled luxury of room 320, Dr. 1010, Alistair Finch was engaged in his own quiet battle. Having been declared fit, he had refused the hospital's attempts to discharge him, citing a desire for further observation. In reality, he was gathering information. From the hushed whispers of the nurses and the evasive, jargon-filled answers from the junior administrator sent to placate him, he had pieced together the monstrous injustice being perpetrated against the young nurse who had saved him. He knew arguing with a bureaucrat like Davies was like trying to teach physics to a rock. It was a pointless exercise. So, he bypassed the entire mountain chain. Using the hospital room's phone, he made a single, international call. It was late in Stockholm, but he knew his old friend would be awake. "Lars. My apologies for the hour," Dr. Finch began, his voice calm, but with an underlying current of steel. "It's Alistair. Yes, I'm fine. A minor tune-up, that's all. Listen, Lars, I'm calling because I witnessed something remarkable, an act of courage so pure and selfless that it frankly puts our academic pursuits to shame. Yes, here at the hospital. A young nurse named Alara Vance. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make demands. He simply told the story. He recounted the facts, the green-yellow gas, the alarms, the sealed doors, and the split-second decision of a young woman to sacrifice her own safety for his. He, a man who had built his life on evidence and objective observation, gave his testimony to his friend, Lars Gunther, a man who happened to be the chairman of the Nobel Committee for Chemistry. He conveyed the character and integrity of the nurse, and the soulless, cowardly actions of the administration that was now trying to destroy her for it. When he hung up, he felt a quiet sense of certainty. He had taken his piece and placed it on a global chessboard, one that Mr. Davies didn't even know existed. The next day, as the deadline to sign the NDA loomed, Alara was staring out her apartment window, watching the rain streak down the glass. The paper was on the table, a pen beside it. She felt numb, defeated. That's when she saw them. 2 black sedans, sleek and immaculate, turned onto her modest, slightly run-down street. They looked like they had been teleported from a different universe. They parked in a synchronized, perfect line directly in front of her building. Her stomach plummeted. It had to be the hospital's lawyers, coming to deliver the final ultimatum, to watch her sign her confession. This was the end. 2 men and a woman emerged. They were dressed not in corporate power suits, but in elegant, dark, tailored clothing that spoke of old-world authority. They moved with a quiet, unhurried purpose, their eyes scanning the building. A knock came at her door. It was soft, but it echoed through the small apartment like a gunshot. She took a deep breath, her hand shaking as she reached for the doorknob. She pulled it open, ready to face the final humiliation. The woman in the center, who had silver hair and piercing blue eyes, offered a small, polite smile. "Miss Alara Vance?" she asked. Her English was perfect, but it was shaped by the gentle, melodic cadence of a Scandinavian accent. Alara nodded, unable to speak. "My name is Dr. Ingrid Holm. These are my colleagues, Mr. Bergman and Mr. Lindstrom," she said, gesturing to the two men beside her. "We have come a very long way to speak with you. We are a delegation from the Karolinska Institute and the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. May we please have a word?" The words hung in the air of the cramped apartment hallway, so profoundly unexpected they seemed to warp reality. The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. Stockholm. Alara stared at them, her mind struggling to connect the grim reality of the NDA on her coffee table with the incomprehensible presence of these people at her door. For a moment she thought it was some cruel, elaborate prank, but there was no cruelty in Dr. Holmes' eyes, only a quiet, serious sincerity. "Dr. Finch contacted us," she explained gently, as if sensing Alara's disorientation. "He told us what you did for him, what you sacrificed." They didn't come inside. They simply stood in her doorway and told her their purpose. They spoke of ideals, of courage, of the fundamental belief that the preservation of human knowledge and its greatest minds was a sacred duty. They spoke of her actions not as a breach of protocol, but as a profound defense of that duty. And then they asked her to come with them. The ride back to Northbridge General was surreal. Alara sat in the silent, leather-scented interior of the sedan, the delegation flanking her like a royal guard. She was no longer a disgraced nurse being summoned for judgment. She was an honored guest being escorted to a reckoning. As they pulled up to the hospital's main entrance, past the ambulances and the smoking employees on their break, she felt a seismic shift in the balance of power. They walked through the automatic glass doors, a silent, formidable phalanx. The receptionist, who had seen Alara just yesterday shuffling out with a face full of despair, looked up, her jaw slackening in confusion. Mr. Davies, alerted by a panicked call from security, intercepted them in the main lobby, his face a mask of flustered irritation. "Can I help you?" he demanded, puffing out his chest, attempting to assert his territorial authority. "This is a secure facility. And this woman," he added, jabbing a finger toward Alara, "is no longer an employee here. She is trespassing." Dr. Holm fixed him with a look of such glacial authority that Davies's words caught in his throat. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You are Mr. Davies, the administrator?" she asked. It was not a question. It was an identification. "We are here on behalf of the Nobel Foundation. We will be making a brief statement in this atrium. You and your staff are welcome to remain." She swept past him without a second glance. Davies was left sputtering, his face turning a blotchy red, as he was rendered utterly impotent in the center of his own fiefdom. Staff members, sensing a momentous event, began to gather. Phones were discreetly pulled out. In the growing crowd, Alara spotted Maria, the junior nurse, her eyes wide with disbelief and dawning joy. She also saw Dr. Regina Croft emerging from a nearby corridor, her face tightening into a knot of confusion and suspicion. Dr. Finch was then wheeled out from a service elevator, dressed in his own clothes, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. He positioned his wheelchair beside Alara, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Doctor." Holmes stepped forward into the center of the atrium, the crowd falling silent. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice clear and resonant, filling the vast, sterile space. "We are a special delegation from the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences. As you may know, the mission of the Nobel Foundation, established by the will of Alfred Nobel, is to honor those who have conferred the greatest benefit on mankind." She paused, letting her eyes sweep over the crowd, finally resting on Mr. Davies and Dr. Croft, who stood frozen at the edge of the assembly. 2 days ago, in this very building, an act of extraordinary courage took place. Dr. Alistair Finch, a Nobel laureate and one of the world's foremost scientific minds, was saved from certain harm not by procedure, not by a manual, but by the swift, selfless, and heroic actions of one individual. She turned and gestured to Alara. "The Foundation recognizes that true merit is not always found in adherence to rules, but sometimes in the wisdom to know when those rules fail to serve our highest ideals, the preservation of life and the advancement of human progress. For her bravery, for embodying the most profound principles of the Hippocratic Oath, and for her courageous defense of a great mind, the Nobel Foundation is bestowing upon Nurse Ilara Vance this special commendation, the Nobel Foundation Humanitarian Medallion. One of her colleagues stepped forward and presented Ilara with a heavy, ornate gold medal in a velvet-lined case. A smattering of applause started, then grew into a thunderous ovation from the nurses, orderlies, and doctors who had witnessed her daily dedication. The flashes from cell phone cameras strobed through the atrium like lightning. Mr. Davies stood as if turned to stone, his face ashen. Dr. Croft looked physically ill, her carefully constructed world of rules and authority having been publicly dismantled by a power she could not comprehend. Their petty tyranny, their threats, their NDAs, all had been rendered meaningless, exposed as the shabby, self-serving actions of cowardly bureaucrats on an international stage. The story was global by nightfall. The hospital, facing a tidal wave of public outrage, went into full damage control. Davies was fired. Croft was placed on indefinite leave. The board issued a groveling, multi-page public apology. 6 months later, Ilara sat in the bright, airy lounge of the Medical Research Institute in Geneva, where she now worked. She was no longer just a nurse. She was a valued colleague, a respected member of a team working on the cutting edge of medicine. Her student loans were paid off by a grant established in her name. Her laptop chimed. A video call from Dr. Finch. His face, vibrant and happy, filled the screen from his home in California. "Ilara, my dear," he said, his smile as warm as ever. "I see you're settling in well. Are they treating you as the hero you are?" Ilara laughed, a genuine, unburdened sound. "They're treating me like a person, Alistair. It's more than I could have asked for." "Nonsense," he countered gently. "You asked for nothing and gave everything. That is the point." She looked out the window at the sun setting over the distant mountains. The sterile hallways of Northbridge General felt a lifetime away. She had faced down a system designed to crush the individual spirit and had won, not by fighting on its terms, but by holding fast to a single, simple truth. She had done what was necessary. And in the end, in the quiet places and the great halls where it truly mattered, that was all that had ever been required.